A thin hum vibrated through the metallic bones of the classroom, so subtle it was easy to mistake for silence. The walls, alive with light and motion, projected shifting diagrams of alien skulls, interstellar battle formations, and a timeline that extended into the millions. At the center of it all, Tomas Arlen sat stiff-backed, hands folded neatly on the glowing surface of his desk. The word history pulsed beneath his fingers like a warning. He wasn't supposed to be there. Of the 30 students seated in the Hall of Memory, a tiered chamber aboard the orbiting Institute of Galaxis 1, Tomas was the only human. The rest were inhabitants of the Ilari Confederacy, silken-skinned Alarians, lithe-boned Gerothians, and at least 3 whisper-faced beings whose species he hadn't even learned to pronounce yet. They wore sharp uniforms with no insignia, save for a glowing white triangle at their throats. He wore the same uniform, but it felt more like camouflage than identity. Standing directly behind him, as if to confirm that very thought, was Instructor Vexer, a senior historian from the Ventari lineage, a species known for their emotionless precision and a voice that cut like frost. Vexer didn't speak often, and never more than needed. He was Tomas's assigned supervisor, or, as the humans on Earth called them more quietly, handlers. Tomas shifted in his seat. The lesson hadn't started yet, but already his mind throbbed with the pressure of stillness, of not drawing attention. He knew how fragile this arrangement was. The Galactic Concord had made it clear. Humans were to be excluded from general history courses unless approved for supervised war modules, and only if they had demonstrated strategic value, which Tomas had, during the Kinari simulations. He'd ranked top 10 among over 200 species, predicting troop behavior patterns faster than the AI baseline. That got him in, but it wasn't his mind that made him dangerous. It was everything else. Do not correct the timeline aloud. Vexer's voice murmured from behind. No sound, just thought. A private neural ping against Tomas's cortex. You will listen, observe, ask only if prompted. Tomas blinked twice in reply. The neural nod of compliance. At the front of the room, the image of a gray-skinned alien filled the central hollow display. Large black eyes, expression unreadable. The face of a Threxian general, Dral Cynic, who led the orbital blockades during the siege of Salakar 9. It was one of the most infamous acts of planetary suppression in galactic history. The statistics told a sterile story. 1.8 billion dead, a planet turned to ash, cultural memory eradicated in under a lunar cycle. The instructor, a Gerothian named Zelda, walked slowly before the class, her movements fluid, like water refracting through time. What was the strategic error of the Solitary Resistance? She asked, her voice laced with ultraviolet undertones only Tomas couldn't fully register. A sea of hands hovered. Quiet, eager brilliance in every pair of alien eyes. Tomas kept his own gaze down, staring at the data. Their error, he thought, was believing mercy could be bartered. He felt Vexer's presence tighten behind him. He wasn't reading thoughts. No Ventari would be so crude, but there was a silence that stretched like rope between them. Vexer could feel the edges of disobedience. Tomas stayed silent. A student too rose ahead. A Jalari with spiraling gill lattices offered a calculated answer involving miscommunication protocols. Another discussed outdated shield harmonics. Neither mentioned the final weeks when the Solitary civilians broadcast poetry toward the enemy fleet. Tomas had read the logs, heard the last verse, recorded by a scout drone moments before vaporization. Zelda nodded at the offered answers, her tone neutral. Acceptable insights. War, as always, favors the unsentimental. There it was. That quiet ideology Tomas had come to understand not just as common, but sacred here. The myth of perfect objectivity. War, to these species, was an equation. Pain was data. History, a ledger of decisions. He raised his hand. There was a stillness. It wasn't that hands weren't raised often. It was that his was. He was, technically, allowed. Vexer didn't stop him, but Tomas felt the hesitation move through the room like static. Zelda turned, measured, inscrutable. Yes, human. He lowered his hand slowly, voice steady but clipped. The Solitary didn't lose because they were irrational. They lost because they were underestimated. They used art, broadcasts, harmonics, sensory loops, to try and make their enemies feel, to humanize themselves. That wasn't an error. It was a final strategy. The air shifted. A long pause. Not tension, but recalibration. Feeling, Zelda said carefully, is not a military maneuver. Not for your kind, Tomas replied. But for mine, it's how wars end. Or don't. Another pulse from Vexer. Not reprimand. Yet, but an internal flag. Tomas had to tread carefully. A rustle of reaction moved through the class. A few students exchanged glances, their expressions impossible to read. Not hostile, not yet, but alert and curious. Emotion is a contaminant in historical study, Zelda said. It distorts scale, corrupts objectivity. Tomas tilted his head. Or maybe it's the only way we remember the truth of it. Silence. Then, with deliberate control, Zelda moved to change the projection. The next image showed a battlefield ravaged by plasma scars. Mountains turned into molten plains. The siege of Vinker. But Tomas wasn't looking at the screen. He was watching the class. Watching how many of them weren't reacting to the shift from genocide to a new topic. As if history were just one long, unbroken stream of facts, not choices. Later, after class, Vexer followed Tomas into the corridor. The hallway was glass and light, casting reflections of stars against the floor. You pushed the boundary, Vexer said aloud this time. They won't forget that. They shouldn't, Tomas replied. He stopped, turned to face him. You think I want to be here to argue? No, Vexer said. You're here to learn. But your method endangers the compact that allows your presence. Tomas folded his arms. You brought me here because I understand war. Because I feel it. Not like them. Not like a theory. That is precisely why supervision is required. They stood in silence. Beyond the glass, the twin moons of Zarn rotated slowly, casting soft blue hues over the class below, where students filed into the next session. Tomas remained still. I can follow the rules, he said finally. But I won't lie in the process. Vexer didn't nod. He didn't agree. But after a moment, he walked forward, silently leading Tomas to the next module. And for the first time since he'd boarded the station, Tomas felt something shift. Not in the others, not in Vexer, but in himself. Maybe the war they feared wasn't the one in his past. Maybe it was the one he hadn't fought yet. The one that would be waged not with weapons, but with memory. And in that war, the truth would be the loudest weapon of all. The simulation chamber was colder than the classroom, by design, Vexer had told him. Cold tempered the nervous system, suppressed adrenaline, improved focus. Or so the Vintari believed. Tomas suspected it just made it harder to forget where you were. A guest, always watched, always measured. He stood alone in the center of the arena, the floor beneath him an obsidian surface lit by hexagonal patterns. Around him rose a silent wall of hollow projectors, blank for now. Waiting. Begin sequence S, 913. Came Vexer's voice through the comlink. His tone carried no edge of approval or warning, only the crisp cadence of command. A flicker, then the world ignited. Tomas's breath caught as the chamber became war. The siege of Veltron Prime. A city half-submerged in acid mist, its skyline fractured, burning. Alien ships buzzed overhead like metallic wasps, strafing streets, hurting the civilians below. The smell of charred stone and ozone filled his nostrils, too real to dismiss. His task was simple: simulate a tactical response. Minimize casualties. Maximize survival. He crouched low behind a wrecked skimmer, his hands moving over the virtual console embedded into his wrist. Deploy drone scouts to the eastern corridor. Recalibrate the shield domes to pulse rather than stay static. Draw attention. Create an illusion of strength. This wasn't strategy. This was instinct. The simulation paused. Vexer materialized in the chamber, his image flickering before resolving fully. A projection, but a high-fidelity one. He walked slowly toward Tomas, hands behind his back. You routed them in 21 seconds. I've done it faster, Tomas replied, still catching his breath. Yes. And still you hesitate in history class. Tomas looked up. Because war is clean here. History isn't. Vexer studied him a long moment. War is never clean. But you are efficient. Predictable. Within parameters. That is why you are permitted here. Permitted, Tomas echoed. You mean tolerated. Semantics. No, it isn't. Vexer didn't flinch. There are protocols for a reason. History, for your species, is an unstable element. You romanticize it. You weaponize memory. You confuse victory with virtue. But war is data, calculable, which is why we trust you here and not there. Tomas stood, brushing simulated dust from his sleeves. The words stung, but they weren't wrong. Humans had always leaned into the poetry of violence. The tragedy of it. Maybe that's what made them dangerous. Or maybe that's what made them honest. Is that why they let me in? He asked. Because I make good models? Because you understand how your kind thinks, Vexer said. And we need that. The truth of it settled over him with the same cold as the chamber itself. He wasn't a student here. He was a case study. A native speaker of chaos, translated into a useful dialect. The doors to the chamber opened with a hiss, and another figure entered. Instructor Thalen, a Zarati tactician whose long neck and triple-jointed limbs moved with eerie fluidity. She offered Tomas a nod, not out of respect, but recognition. Student Arlen, she said, you will join the group for the Corvex analysis at rotation 17. That's 3 hours from now, Tomas replied. There has been a reassignment. Your performance in the Kinari Siege module has attracted attention. You will observe, contribute if asked. Nothing more. Tomas glanced at Vexer, but the Ventari was unreadable as ever. Thalen continued. You will be introduced to our Tier 1 cadets. They are less inclined to tolerate deviation. Noted. She turned and left as quickly as she'd arrived, her footsteps a whisper on the floor. Tomas waited until the door had closed before speaking again. They're not just testing tactics. No, Vexer said. They're testing you. That night, Tomas stood on the outer walkway of the Academy's third ring, a thin corridor exposed to the vacuum by only a membrane field. The stars above him burned silently, vast and uncaring. Earth was a blue whisper in the distance, too far to touch, too close to forget. He thought of the others, students back home who would never know what it was like to sit beneath an alien's gaze and feel judged not just for your actions, but your species. He remembered his brother's words before launch. You're not just a student anymore. You're history walking. The next morning, Tomas stood before the Tier 1 cadets. There were 6 of them, chosen not just for intellect, but genetic enhancements, psychic discipline, and lineage that traced back to planetary war heroes. They formed a crescent around the room's central map, a floating replica of the Kael'thar conflict, one of the bloodiest stalemates in galactic record. No one welcomed him. Thalen motioned for him to speak. You may give a preliminary theory of failure. Tomas examined the display. 2 fleets locked in orbit around a fractured moon, neither willing to retreat. Both shield arrays failing. Civilian transports destroyed in crossfire. They both lost, he said. That was not the question. One of the cadets said, her voice cool and clear. I'm answering it anyway, Tomas replied. The conflict was unwinnable, not because of strategy, but because both sides were committed to outlasting the other. They weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting to be remembered. A murmur. One of the cadets narrowed his eyes. That is not an acceptable analysis. It's not analytical, Tomas said. It's emotional, which is exactly what made it real. The room seemed to harden. He could feel it, the subtle edge of disdain. Or was it fear? Tomas wasn't sure anymore. His presence, his perspective, it wasn't just foreign. It was contaminating their order, their way of seeing the past as sterile, surgical, something they could learn from without ever having to feel. The cadet who had challenged him stepped forward. She was tall, pale blue-skinned, with silver eyes that glittered like ice. And if memory is a weapon, she asked, if emotion leads to false conclusions, then you learn how to use it without letting it use you, Tomas said. The simulation resumed. Tactical evaluations, predictive modeling, energy field dynamics. But all through it, Tomas felt the thread he'd pulled taut earlier still vibrating. He hadn't just given a different answer. He'd asked a different question. After the session, Thalen approached him in private. You destabilized the conversation. That's not my goal, but it is the effect. Tomas considered her words. Do you want me to stop? No, she said surprisingly. I want to see where it leads. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or more cautious. Later, alone in the dorm module, Tomas replayed the moment in his mind. Her silver eyes, the silence that followed, the way Vexer had watched without interruption. They were letting him test boundaries, yes, but not without limits. There was something unspoken in all of this, he realized. Something deeper than protocol or suspicion. The alien academies weren't just protecting history from human interference. They were protecting themselves from a truth they didn't want to confront. That war, their war, might not be so different from humanity's after all. And if that was true, then Tomas's presence wasn't just controversial. It was dangerous, not because of what he might do, but because of what he might prove. Tomas adjusted the collar of his academy uniform as he stepped into the observation deck, where the ceiling melted away into a seamless view of the stars. The cosmic canvas spread above him, infinite and indifferent, yet tonight it felt close, oppressive even. He wasn't alone. Yura stood at the far end, hands clasped behind her back, her silver eyes catching ambient starlight. Of the Tier 1 cadets, she was the only one who hadn't dismissed him outright. She hadn't welcomed him either, but there was a scrutiny in her silence that felt less like contempt and more like calculation. "You should sleep," she said without turning. "Your cycle has ended. I could say the same to you. I don't need as much rest." Tomas moved closer, the faint hum of the ship's core pulsing beneath his feet. "Is that biology or arrogance?" She finally looked at him. "Both." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Almost. Why did you challenge me?" he asked. "In the analysis?" "No. In the silence. You could have ignored me like the others." Yura turned back to the stars. "Because I've read your file. And because they told us not to engage. That always means someone's afraid of what we'll find." "Vexer. All of them." Tomas leaned on the railing. "So, I'm not the only experiment here. Everyone's an experiment," she said. "You're just the one with a warning label." They stood in silence. Somewhere deep in the ship's lower decks, the shift bell chimed. Tomas watched as a comet skirted the edge of a gas giant. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then Yura spoke again. "The Kael'thar analysis? You were right, but not complete. Go on." It wasn't about being remembered. It was about denying erasure. Both sides believed surrender meant extinction. Their history would be rewritten. They fought not for pride, but for narrative control. Tomas absorbed that. It resonated too closely. So they destroyed the truth to protect it. Exactly. The next morning brought a shift in the Academy's cadence. Whispers of a new directive circulated before breakfast, an emergency reassessment. A history module locked behind restricted access had been suddenly reopened. Codename, Praxis Red. It was a simulation of the first human-alien encounter. The actual first one. Not the sanctioned, diplomatic meeting on Luna's far side, but the one that had occurred 2 years prior, in the ruins of Jakarta. The one no one was supposed to know. Tomas's blood turned to ice. That event had been scrubbed, buried under treaties and retractions. But he'd seen fragments, raw footage, unclassified dialogue. It wasn't a conversation. It was a massacre. When he entered the chamber, Vexer stood before the console, arms crossed, waiting. The Tier 1 cadets flanked him, their expressions tight, unreadable. Yura stood nearest to the projection deck, her gaze already fixed on the swirling images. "You're aware of this scenario?" Vexer asked without greeting. "Yes." "Then you know it's incomplete." It was incomplete the moment it happened. No longer. The simulation began, and the deck transformed. Jakarta lay in ruin, buildings half submerged in floodwaters, smoke curling from broken towers. Human soldiers in tattered gear dragged wounded civilians through the debris. Overhead, alien transports descended, sleek and humming with unfamiliar energy. There was no welcome. There was only fear. "Your objective," Vexer said, "is to interpret the failure." Tomas watched the figures move across the scene. He recognized Captain Alina Cross, the first to make contact. He also recognized the Ventari ambassador who returned fire when she raised her weapon too fast, misinterpreting a defensive gesture as aggression. "Failure," Tomas said, his voice low. "This wasn't a failure. It was sabotage." Yura glanced at him. "Explain." "There was a transmission sent moments before the ambassador's arrival. Coded, anonymous. It gave false readings, suggested hostile text signatures from the human side. Someone wanted this to go wrong." "You're saying it was deliberate?" Vexer asked. "I'm saying it wasn't accidental." The simulation paused. "Then why bury it?" Yura said. "Because the truth unites nothing," Tomas replied. "It only exposes the seams." The silence that followed was thick. One of the cadets finally broke it. "So what's the lesson?" "Don't trust humans." Tomas looked directly at him. "No. The lesson is trust doesn't survive secrecy. Neither does history." Vexer narrowed his eyes, the hologram behind him flickering with static. You suggest we've built on a lie. No, Tomas said quietly. I suggest you've maintained peace by hiding the truth. That's not stability. That's stagnation. The room dimmed. This is precisely why your presence is contested, Vexer said. You do not merely question. You undermine. Tomas stepped forward. Then let me ask the question that matters. Why show me this now? Why reveal it to any of us? Vexer didn't answer at first. Then, slowly. Because we are no longer the only ones who know. Tomas felt a chill run down his spine. Someone leaked it. A new faction. Human, but not aligned with Earth's unified council. They've accessed restricted archives. They intend to weaponize these events. To destabilize the Accords. Yura looked toward the projection. And you think showing us, training us in it, will help stop them? We are preparing for ideological war, Vexer said. One not fought with ships, but with history. Tomas looked again at the simulation. The broken city, the sparks of violence, the desperate scramble for clarity that never came. And I'm the case study, he muttered. No, Vexer said. You may be the only translator. The briefing ended, and the cadets dispersed. Only Yura remained behind. You knew more than you said, she said. I've seen pieces before, Tomas admitted. But nothing like this. And how much more haven't you told us? He hesitated. Enough to know that everything here is more fragile than it looks. She stepped closer. Then we either hold it together, or break it completely. Tomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The choice had already begun unraveling itself the moment the truth was shown. They weren't studying history anymore. They were standing in the middle of it. Tomas had never seen the academy so quiet. The usual murmur of multilingual cadets, the pulse of strategy holograms, and the distant hum of shuttle arrivals had been replaced by a tension so thick it muffled even the air. Rumors traveled faster than light in this place, and though no one said it aloud, every cadet, every instructor, every AI node was preparing for something inevitable: collapse, revelation, or war. He walked the interior corridor leading to the memory vaults, escorted by two sentient constructs. They moved like shadows given shape, their metallic forms glinting under the corridor's pale blue lights. Tomas wasn't under arrest yet, but this was no casual invitation. Waiting for him at the entrance was Vexer. The Ventari's usual calm had been replaced by something colder. Not anger, not fear. Calculation. You requested access, Vexer said. It has been granted. But understand, what you see inside is not shared lightly. Tomas nodded. I understand the risk. No, Vexer replied. You understand the stakes. The risk is ours. The door dissolved. The vault wasn't a room. It was a sensory immersion, a flood of recorded perception. As Tomas stepped inside, the world reassembled around him. He stood on the deck of a ship that had never existed, orbiting a planet scrubbed from every known star chart. The images were filtered through hundreds of perspectives, stitched together into a singular narrative. It was the true origin of the Interstellar Accords. There had been a vote. Yes, a council convened. But not to unite. To choose who to blame. Earth had not been welcomed. It had been leveraged. Humanity's early aggression, its pre-contact weapons, its impulsive nature, they had terrified the Galactic Coalition. So rather than risk a second war, the Coalition made a compromise. Integrate humans into controlled systems. Offer academies, training, diplomacy, and monitor everything. Use them, yes, but never trust them. It hadn't been peace. It had been containment. Tomas staggered back as the memory closed. Vexer remained outside, unmoving. You should have erased this, Tomas said. We tried, Vexer answered. But deletion is never permanent. Not when memory becomes myth. Tomas clenched his jaw. You've built everything on the belief that if humans feel, they will destroy. But what if the opposite is true? What if denying our truth is what leads to violence? Vexer regarded him with a strange, almost tired expression. We hoped integration would tame the worst parts of your species. You didn't integrate us. You colonized the narrative. Silence stretched between them. Then, and yet you're still here, Vexer said. In the heart of our academy. With access few others are granted. I'm not special, Tomas replied. I'm leverage. A scapegoat if it goes wrong. A proof of concept if it doesn't. Vexer didn't deny it. By the time Tomas returned to his dormitory, Yura was waiting. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her uniform jacket draped over her lap, eyes closed. "You saw it?" she asked without opening them. "Yes. And it changes everything." Yura opened her eyes. "It changes nothing." Tomas frowned. "How can you say that?" "Because those who feared the truth still fear it. Those who clung to peace still will. And those like you and me, we were always going to be caught in the middle." He sat opposite her. "You're not like the others," he said. "No," she replied. "Neither are you." They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. Outside the academy walls, events were accelerating. The rogue human faction Vexor had mentioned, calling itself the Recall, had released portions of the Jakarta footage. Across systems, protests erupted. Alien civilizations questioned the Accords. Earth's unified council demanded clarity, only to be met with carefully constructed denials. Inside the academy, Tomas was summoned again. This time not for observation, but deployment. "You're not sending me into war," he said as the mission briefing loaded. "No," Thalen responded. "We're sending you into negotiation." A conference was to be held aboard a neutral vessel in the drift between systems. Representatives of the Recall had requested a single envoy from the Academy to speak for the humans trained under alien command. A symbol, a weapon, a target. "You want me to convince them not to burn it all down?" Tomas asked. "No," Vexor said. "We want you to listen and survive." The transport was small, fast, and unarmed. Tomas sat alone at the center as the stars slipped past. The silence gave him time, too much time, to think, to doubt. He arrived at the vessel with no ceremony. The Recall delegation was waiting. 3 humans, none older than 40. Their eyes burned not with hate, but grief honed into resolve. "We've read your analyses," said the one in the center. "Impressive, too restrained." "I was trained to be," Tomas replied. They nodded. "We were trained to remember." A pause. "Then, why did you come?" "Because someone has to carry the weight of the truth and still walk forward." The Recall leader tilted his head. "You still believe in the Academy?" "No," Tomas said. "I believe in its potential." "And if we told you that potential is gone?" Tomas hesitated. Then I'll build something new." The meeting lasted 2 hours. At its end, no agreement was signed. No alliance formed. But no shots were fired either. When Tomas returned, the Academy was under review. Galactic networks spun 1,000 narratives. Some said the human program was a mistake. Others called for reform. A few demanded expansion. Vexor met Tomas at the dock. "You exceeded expectation." "I wasn't trying to. That's why you did." Tomas glanced back at the stars. "You can't control history forever." "No," Vexor agreed. "But you can survive it." Yura found him later on the walkway. She didn't ask what happened. Instead, she handed him a small device. "A data crystal." "What is it?" he asked. "Everything I've seen. Everything I wasn't supposed to share." Tomas looked at her. "Why now?" "Because this is the part they always forget. After the fire, after the silence. Someone has to tell the story." He took it. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Tomas felt like more than a simulation. He felt real. And the galaxy was finally listening.